In Romans 14, Naomi, can you get Romans 14, please? Verse 4. Sorry, Romans 15, verse 4.
For whatever was written in former days was written for our instruction, that through endurance, through the encouragement of the scriptures, we might have hope.
All right, Romans 15, verse 4. Yes, in context, is talking about the Old Testament. We understand that point. But what does it teach us about the usefulness of Scripture? What does it teach?
It's like a history lesson.
Okay, and what?
And so we can always go back and see how things happened back then.
Yeah, so we can learn from what has come before. It's when you read the Old Testament, we come sometimes we'll say, well, the Old Testament's not our authority today, which is true. But then you can go to this extreme. Well, then don't study the Old Testament. Well, that's not true, because there are things we can learn about God and His people, about how His people behaved, whether it is good or whether it is bad. And we can take what we learn about how God dealt with those people when they sinned, and how God dealt with those people when they were righteous, and we can come forward because we worship the same God. We serve the same God. The same God will have the same expectations, whatever He has given us. Lord.
We have an expression, those that don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it.
Yes, that's true.
Right. So if you don't learn how the Jews were punished for their rebelliousness, well, we're just going to repeat it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it does have value to us.
It does. Paul would continue on in another passage of Scripture in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. So if we go to 1 Corinthians 10, we'll read the first 10 verses. Verse 12 verses. And we'll do 2 verses each. We'll start with Calla, go to Gord, and back and around, whoever wants to read. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 12.
I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses, into the cloud, and into the sea.
All ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ.
Come back to Jeff.
But with most of them, God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Now these things became our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted.
Do not become idolaters, as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Nor let us commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 fell.
Nor are we to put the Lord to the test, as some of them did, and were killed by the snakes, nor grumble, as some of them did, and were killed by the destroyer.
Now all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall.
Verse 12 is the very famous verse from this chapter, but it starts with a therefore. Let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. It goes, what were the problems Israel faced? What were some of the problems that they had while God was leading them in the wilderness? Rebelliousness would be one.
Sin.
Well, sin in general, yes, but what specifically?
Sexual morality.
Sexual immorality, yeah. Lust. Idolatry.
Drunkenness.
Like all of these were there. Yet they were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And so, they crossed the Red Sea. They crossed the Jordan River. And so in that sense, Paul was talking about a baptism of sorts there. They were the people of God, and yet they did those things. But God punished them for those things when they sinned. And therefore, Paul comes along and says, these happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition. So why do we have the things we do in the Old Testament? We don't have everything that happened to Israel, but we have the things that are written for our admonition, for our spiritual growth, for our benefit. And therefore, him who thinks he stands, take heed lest he fall. That's what we have to remember. And so that's what we're going to be doing in this lesson, because the lesson is titled, I Can Profit from My Own Mistakes and the Mistakes of Others. And so what we're going to be looking at, we're not going to be so much talking about our own mistakes in the sense of, I'm going to be asking you, well, what were your mistakes? But you can see your own mistakes through the ones that we are going to talk about. Because we all have been in situations, maybe not exactly the same situations, but we have acted in the same types of manners of sin as those who came before. So the first one we're going to look at is Moses in Numbers 20. Let's go back to Numbers chapter 20. The question is, what can we learn from the mistakes of Moses found in Numbers 20, verses 1 to 13? And so we'll come across, we'll start with Francesca. She can read verses 1 and 2. We'll do 2 verses each. We'll come across to Abigail and up, and then back to Naomi as well. Start Numbers 20, verses starting at 1 and 2.
And the children of Israel, the whole congregation, came into the wilderness in the first month, and the people stayed in Kadesh. And Miriam died there and was buried there. Now there was no water for the congregation, so they gathered against Moses and Aaron.
Abigail, Numbers 20, verses 3 and 4.
And the people contended with Moses and spoke, saying, If only we had died when our brethren died before the Lord. Why have you brought up the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness, that we and our animals should die here?
Dexter, you want to read 5 and 6?
And why have you made us come up out of Egypt to bring us to the evil place? It is not a place of grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, nor is there any water to drink. So Moses and Aaron went from the presence of assembly to the door of the tabernacle of meeting, and they fell on their faces. And the glory of the Lord appeared to them.
Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Take the rod, you and your brother Aaron, gather the congregation together. Speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will yield this water. Thus you shall bring water for them out of the rock, and give drink to the congregation and their animals.
And Moses took the staff from before the Lord as he commanded him. Then Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, Hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock?
Then Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod, and water came forth abundantly, and the congregation and their beasts drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, Because you have not believed me to treat me as holy in the sight of the sons of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them.
Verse 13, Gordon.
This was the water of Meribah, because the children of Israel contended with the Lord, and he was hallowed among them.
Okay, so what was the problem here in the beginning? What was the problem that we're facing in Numbers 20?
Basically, they were complaining that it was good in Israel and in Egypt. They got pomegranates, they got all these different kinds of food, and they were missing out on it. They were thirsty, they were hungry, and barely aching about everything.
What was wrong with their complaint? Cal is exactly right.
It was unjustified.
Well, why was it unjustified?
Well, because he didn't have it so good in Egypt. Yeah, first of all, they were slaves. They were treated very, very badly, whipped, beaten, forced to labor.
Yeah. Had God provided for them in the wilderness thus far? Yes, of course he has. Yeah, not, well, we'll get into that, but yeah, he did provide for them though. Yeah.
Most importantly is God had not failed in anything he said he would do.
Yeah.
So it's unjust to accuse someone of failing in something when they have not failed in anything. It's different for us because we can see our own failures. But God does not fail, and they had no reason to.
Yeah. In fact, by the time we're talking here in Numbers 20, there's a reason they're not in Canaan right now. They had already rebelled against the Lord and refused to take the promised land. And so the events of Numbers 20, if they want to know why they're stuck in the wilderness, it's not God's fault. It's theirs. They should have been in Canaan by this point had they taken the land as God had told them to. But God had not failed. God had provided for them along the way. Everything that God has said was so. But they were misremembering. They looked fondly. We do that too. I was talking to my brother this week, and I'm not going to tell you what we were talking about, but I was talking to my brother, and he says, I didn't remember that. It was 2 years ago. What we were talking about, he didn't remember it. And I don't blame him for it. A lot of things happen, but I mean, that's the frailty of our memory. We like to remember the things that happen that are good and forget the things that happen that are bad. But then when we start to complain and misremember at the same time, we are going to be unjust. They were murmuring. They were complaining unjustly against God. Now we have Moses. What was he told to do? Bill, you had something first?
Yeah, first of all, I thought with Moses is, and it's a good example for us, we need to learn how to handle and people that are complaining all the time.
Yeah.
Because those people's complaints and whining were the major cause of Moses' sin.
Yeah, which is exactly where we're going. Yeah, absolutely. Exactly. We have frustration here. Moses, of course, by this time he led them out of Egypt. They've been wandering in the wilderness. They were at Sinai for a year. We don't know how long after leaving to have to go back into the wilderness this is, but we could be 3, 4, 5, 6 years later. And he hears this all the time. It's constant complaining. And that's what's going to lead to Moses' sin here. But what was he told to do?
He was told to speak to the rock so it could bring forth water.
Okay. Is this the first time a miracle like this was given to Israel? Jeff's shaking his head. No. Soon after they left Egypt, in the book of Exodus, we have a similar story. We won't read it, but Moses was told to strike the rock, and out of the rock would come water. And Jesus talks about this, and so does the New Testament talk about that event too. So we have Moses. He's told what to do. Before he strikes the rock? That's the commission of the sin. That's the result. But it actually started beforehand. The root cause of that wasn't striking the rock. Sort of going to what Bill was saying. What did he say before? All right, well, that's a good, must we. So he was taking power upon himself. Must we. All right, what else? If you were to read this, or if you were listening to Moses, if you were there, how would he have been delivering those statements? Pardon me?
It was a rebuke.
Is a rebuke? What would his probably...
He was frustrated.
He was frustrated, which led to what?
Sin.
Well, but before that, anger. It led to anger. Frustration can lead to anger. And he had a right, he was justified in being angry that the people were murmuring. However, his anger, when he acted in anger, that's where he ran into the problem. Jeff, you had something.
Psalm 106 describes that event and says that Moses spoke rashly because of what it did.
Yeah.
Because of the people.
Yeah.
No excuse, but he allowed himself to lose his temper.
That's what can happen when we get angry. We act in a way we would not normally act. And Moses likely, in his rashness, forgot what God had said. He had done this before. And when we start doing something, we get angry and we just do. We don't consider that there might be something different. Have you ever been out driving and your car, you say, what am I doing here? And we sometimes say, well, our car drove us here. No, we drove ourselves there, but we're always going the same route or doing the same thing. But when we get distracted, we forget what we're actually supposed to be doing. Well, Moses' anger distracted him, and he struck the rock instead of speaking to it. What was the problem? God sent the water because Israel needed water. God was going to provide them water. But what was the problem? God said what the problem was in verse 12. Didn't hallow him. But what did he actually say?
He didn't give God the credit.
All right, he didn't give God the credit. Right at the very beginning of verse 12.
Did not believe me.
You did not believe me. That's quite a statement to say. Why would God say that? He's not saying that they didn't believe in him. Why didn't he believe him? Like, why does God say that? Jeff?
When we don't obey God, that's unbelief.
Yeah.
If we don't obey what he's commanded us to do, we're not believing.
Yeah.
It's the same thing that in the book of Hebrews, in chapter 3, when the Hebrew writer...
Sorry? I don't know what's going on. I have to keep that on, but I don't know. Go ahead.
When the Hebrew writer talks about the children of Israel, why they couldn't go into the promised land, it said because they did not obey.
Yeah.
And it says they could not enter in because of unbelief.
Yeah.
Not obeying is unbelief.
Not obeying is unbelief. That should give us pause to recognize that sin is unbelief. We may not have lost total faith in God. Moses believed God exists. God existed. He didn't come along and say, well, God just doesn't exist anymore. No. He wouldn't have struck the rock if he thought God didn't exist. But it was unbelief. It was something he needed to pay attention to.
You said that Moses had struck the rock before.
Yes.
Where,
that's in that's Exodus 17. I knew it was somewhere between 15 and 20. But he had struck the rock before. And so we can learn from Moses' mistakes, because I don't want us to dwell too much, because we have a couple others to discuss. But Moses got frustrated, which led to anger, which led to sin. It goes to Bill's point, which was Moses, by this time, was so frustrated that he had not been dealing with complaining properly. And that can lead to sin. Moses, was Moses justified in being angry? This people had complained and complained and complained and complained and gone off into idolatry. I can understand Moses' frustration, but we have to learn how to handle that. Moses paid for his mistake. He couldn't enter the promised land. That was the punishment for his mistake. God didn't abandon him. Moses repented of it. But Moses, I'm certain, learned from that we are to hallow God. Hallow.
But in frustration, I could see where he thought God told him to strike the rock.
I said, I believe in his frustration he acted rashly, as Psalms 106 said. But when we act rashly, we make mistakes. like I said, when we get frustrated, when you just act out of impulse, that's our problem half the time.
I guess because he did it before. I don't
Yeah, yeah. I said that's why I believe he struck the rock. He did it before, but he didn't follow God. We're not going to read 1 Samuel 2 and 3, but I asked the question anyway. What can we learn from the mistakes of Eli? You have to remember. That's why I give you the questions a little early. 1 Samuel chapters 2 and 3. Sure enough, they start early today. 1 Samuel 2 and 3. What do we learn from the mistakes of Eli? What were the mistakes of Eli? Let's first of all talk about that. Eli is the high priest in the days of Samuel. So what do we learn from him? Like, what were his mistakes? Bill?
I thought first was his rebuke to his sons.
Okay, how would you characterize that?
Well, Deuteronomy, Moses said, rebellious son, stone him.
Yeah.
And here Eli's got two that are committing fornication.
Yeah. And they were stealing from the sacrifices. They were taking what was God's. They were leading the people off. Can you imagine? These were the priests. Eli was the high priest. These were the priests. And you had them behaving this way. What do you think the people, when they see their religious leaders behaving this way, what do you think they think?
They'd fall into sin too.
They'd fall into sin too. They would think, well, if the priest can do it, and he's holy before God, and God accepts him, certainly God would accept me. But Bill said rightly, under the law of Moses, these were adult children. These weren't little children who didn't know better. These were adult children. That there was punishment for children who rebelled against God. And it was quite severe under the law of Moses. That they weren't obeying their father. Eli was not a fornicator. Eli was not an idolater, or he was not, as far as we know, stealing from the sacrifices of God. But how would you describe the character of Eli in not reproving his sons?
Very weak.
Very weak. Absolutely.
He made me worried. Sometimes as parents we're challenged with that. We're afraid to offend the child.
Yeah. Because we love our children.
Yeah.
And we're saying, well, if I lash out, what will happen? Well, how will they respond? But sometimes we have to do hard things. Sometimes the behavior is such that we actually have to tell them, this is wrong, and there's going to be punishment for what you are doing. These were the priests of God. They need to behave a lot better. Chad?
There's two things here we keep touching on, though. He was a father, the leader of his home. He was a spiritual leader.
Yeah.
So there's two responsibilities he had. And sadly, he failed in them both.
Yeah.
Because as priests, he should have looked on them less as his sons and more as the priests of God.
Yeah.
And that cannot continue.
Yeah. It was his job to oversee the tabernacle, to oversee that the sacrifices were being done properly. Because Eli, of all people, knew this is coming out of the period of the judges, knew what happens when they disobeyed God. He should have known that God was not pleased. And, of course, Samuel is the one who gets the vision from God and the dream that Eli's house is not going to continue as priests. And it would take some more years, but that would eventually come to pass in the days of Solomon, where Zadok the priest didn't come from the house of Eli. He came from another house, the house of Eleazar. And so we can learn from the character of Eli that we have to stand up for truth, no matter who it is. Can you answer this? Someone is calling, and they've called about 3 or 4 times. We have to stand up for our for the truth. We have to stand up for righteousness, no matter who it is that's committing it. And in the church, we might come along and say, well, if we stand up, they might not attend anymore. Well, that may be. But our concern is out of their salvation and out of the purity of the church. That should be our concern. What does God desire? And so we can learn from Eli that sometimes standing up for truth is hard, but we need to do it. Jeff?
He did get after them. He knew it was wrong.
Yeah.
He gave them what we would call a good verbal tongue lashing.
Yeah.
But
didn't do anything about it. Yeah. Yeah, like talk is talk. Talk is cheap. We sometimes will say, well, maybe if I talk to them, maybe that will be it. But, well, if that doesn't work, then we have to do more. You can't say, well, that's just enough. We've got to do more. So that's what we can learn from the mistakes of Eli. We don't have time to read the entire section of Luke 15, 11 to 32 either. That's the parable of the prodigal son. That's the third in Jesus' parables about the parable of the lost sheep, the lost coin, the parable of the prodigal son. What did the prodigal son do? Let's remind ourselves of what he did. How did the parable start?
He said to his father, give me my inheritance so that I can go my way.
All right, that's where it started. What would you say his attitude is right there? Give me my inheritance so that I can go off and go away. What would you call that? Sin. Sin of what? Greed. I call it sin of greed. Inheritance usually we get when our parents die. Sometimes our parents might give it to us early, but that's the parents' choice. We shouldn't be going out after and saying, Mom, Dad, give me what you owe me. They don't owe you that. But the father was rich, and he said, okay, you want it, I'll give it to you. He didn't argue with them. He could have said no, but he didn't. What'd the son go off and do? He squandered it how?
Living it up.
He was living it up. So riotous living. Have you ever noticed that when someone's rich, they have many friends? A lot of people love to spend other people's money. It's absolutely great to spend other people's money. You can always, when you're spending other people's money, doesn't seem like anything is too expensive. You can go to the best restaurants. You can go and have the best things. And you can be around the best people. So they say. My dad always used to say when it came to alcohol commercials, you always see them in the bars having a great time, living it up. You don't see the alcoholics in the gutter, the angry drunk who beats his family, the guy who kills others through drunk driving. You don't see any of that. At the end they say, well, drink responsibly. Responsibly would be not to drink at all. But this prodigal son went off and lived a rather worldly life. What happened to him in the end? He came to his senses, and what did he do?
He decided to go back home and say, Father, and repent. Go to his father and said, Father, I've sinned against you in heaven.
Yeah, and?
No longer worthy to be called thy son.
No longer worthy to be called thy son. He didn't go back and say, Father, I repent, now give me back my place. No, that's not what he said. He didn't say that at all. He said, Father, I have sinned against you. I want to come back, but I'm going to come back as a servant. Now his father didn't allow that. He gave him a robe. He killed the fatted calf to his brother's disgust. But what can we learn from the mistakes of the prodigal son? We can learn a lot from his repentance. But what can we learn from his mistakes, Bill?
Well, one illustration is that when we want to leave God's side, He's not going to stop us.
That's a good lesson to learn, because we can always focus on the worldly things, but when God wants to, we might think, well, God doesn't want us to go. He doesn't. But He will allow us to go. And that's the important thing, is He will allow us to go if that is what we want to. And that's something to remember, that we can certainly go if we want to. Now, we'll be punished for it. As far as if he would have stayed away, the father wasn't going after him either. Father was looking for him, but wasn't going after him. Son had to return in humility. Bill.
We never want to face the fact, especially when we're young, but look at the consequences.
Yeah. Yeah, like as far as the son suffered humiliation. The son didn't have to wind up in the gutter. He didn't have to be there. He could have stayed with his father, could have lived with his father. His father was quite wealthy, but he obviously wanted to do things his father wouldn't have allowed. And so what we can learn is that living off into the world will take us farther than we want to go, and will make us pay a price we don't want to pay. And we would be better off adhering to the will of the Father. Because even though we might say, well, Father doesn't want me to drink. Father doesn't want me to have sex outside of marriage. Father doesn't want me to lie. He doesn't want me to be greedy. I see all these other people, they're living great lives. Well, sort of like what Instagram and Facebook and all that do. You always put up the good-looking things, and you wind up not knowing that there's a lot of filters on people, that they're only showing you the good things and not the bad, that a lot of people are broken inside. We got all of that. And in the end, the son knew that he was better off in the Father's house. Let's quickly, Jack quickly, and then we'll go to 3 John.
One thing we can learn from his mistakes was sometimes when we get what we want, what makes us happy, we automatically assume it must be good.
Yes.
If I get a job, for example, then, this is such a good job, great, but then my time with my family suffers. My time with my brethren suffered. No, that wasn't a good job.
Yeah.
It advanced my career. It makes me more money. This is great. God has blessed me.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
You had to make a choice and you made the wrong one.
Yeah. Well, and God may have given you what you wanted, but not what you needed. You wanted something. God may have allowed it, but you suffer because of it. Quickly, 3 John verse 9 says, I wrote to the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to have preeminence among them, does not receive us. What was the problem with Diotrephes? What was the problem with Diotrephes?
Thinks I'm higher than everybody else.
He thought himself higher than everyone else. If you notice, this week, there was a major event that happened on television. The world stopped for this event on Thursday. What was this event? New Pope. The only time you can get most of television to cover anything religious, new Pope. Well, the position of the Pope sounds a lot like Diotrephes here. He loved preeminence. He was the gatekeeper of who was in the church and who was out, or at least in this local church. He was divisive. We can learn something about this. God does not want us to be trying to climb up over other people. He wants us to all be united in love, to be seeking the same thing, and to be serving one another. He does not want us to have this type of attitude where I'm better than you for whatever reason we come up with. And so, some questions we might ask ourselves, things to consider. Do I sometimes bury my opportunities and then make a poor excuse for not doing my duty? How many times have I said I can't when I knew I could? When others are not doing the Lord's work, do I always have too much to do to find my place in the work? And what will the Lord do with me if I do not work in His service? We can learn from the mistakes of others. Let's read our scriptures. Let's know what they say. And let's not repeat the mistakes of the past. I'm not ashamed to